This week on The Wheelhouse. Sexual assault in the Coast Guard. And a little later, kindergarten cutoffs. For Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people, and we got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. For years, the U.S. Coast Guard has ignored or overlooked sexual assault allegations at its service academy in New London, Connecticut. Late last month, news broke that leaders of the military branch never disclosed a years-long investigation into those failures. Now, federal lawmakers, including those from Connecticut, are demanding accountability. For more on this, we're joined by my colleague, a great colleague of mine. She comes to us from the South today. She's joining us over Zoom. Here comes Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter from CT Mirror and Connecticut Public. Not like the Deep South, but you're in Capitol Hill. How are you this morning, Lisa?
We're south of Connecticut. It's great to be back.
Everything is south of here. Hey, thank you so much for coming on. And I just want to remind folks that if they give us a call right now, we'd be happy to call to talk to them and get to any questions that they might have. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Lisa, what's Operation Fouled Anchor, and what did the Coast Guard do about it?
So it's an investigation that, it basically is a two-pronged thing, right? Because it's looking at allegations over a certain period of time between basically 1988 and 2006, and is when all of these allegations of sexual assault and sexual harassment and rape at the Coast Guard Academy were coming up, but they seem to be either unreported or dismissed, ignored, not prosecuted. And then so when this kind of came to light a bit more recently, Operation Fouled Anchor basically happened, which was the investigation into those allegations. And so that was a long process. That was a long investigation that basically ran from 2014 up until 2020. So pretty recently. And so no one really, publicly, I guess, knew much of the existence of it or the scope of it until the CNN story that came out last month. And so this has been something that's been going on basically and discussed in some way in the Coast Guard Academy for 3 decades.
Why did these sexual assault allegations go unreported for so long? Were they ignored, you think?
Yeah, largely ignored. Not always the standards in place or really rules and how things should go reported or be prosecuted. Over a number of years now, I mean, we've seen reports of this popping up all over the military and in their, in these academies for other military branches and services. And so, new policies come into place, but I'll get into a little bit more later why the Coast Guard Academy and the Coast Guard is kind of absolved from it, because it has a different jurisdiction within the federal government from the other military academies. And so a lot of things went underreported, and a lot of the times they just weren't prosecuted. It was either, I guess, more of a statute of limitations. It had gone too long since the alleged, crime had happened. There was no real understanding of how it actually should be prosecuted, or it was done in a way that wasn't as independent. So kind of a whole mix of things. And frankly, a lot of the times people just don't report these things because they know it's going to get ignored and swept under the rug.
Tremendous analysis there from Lisa Hagan, who comes to us from the Connecticut Mirror and, of course, Connecticut Public. 888-720-9677 if you'd like to talk to us. Just to follow up on what Lisa said, I want to give you a little bit of a timeline here. Reported assaults investigated in Operation Fouled Anchor occur between 1988 and 2006. Coast Guard says they hear about the first one that occurred in the previous time frame I'd mentioned in about 2014. It's not until 2020 that the U.S. Coast Guard takes any kind of action. And then, as Lisa just said, you have the CNN report that comes out in the middle of 2023. So how does what's happening with the U.S. Coast Guard kind of fit into this wider context of sexual assault, harassment in these U.S. military academies, Lisa?
Yeah, this is a bit of a persistent problem across the armed services. This is not something that is unique to the Coast Guard Academy. we've seen reports of very similar types of allegations, and then also the result of it not being, prosecuted or reported or kind of going under the radar for some time. And the same thing happened at the Air Force Academy, where this big this whistleblower kind of came out in 2003 to kind of expose a lot of this, which eventually led to an inspector general investigation. And that's 2003. That's 2 decades now, and we're still seeing similar types of problems and underreporting happening in different branches. So this time being in the Coast Guard Academy from New London. And so again, it's something that has happened for a while. It's a lot of lawmakers and people looking at this say this is a larger pattern and culture problem, and it's something that Congress has tried to seriously address, especially within the past decade or two, and something that does get a decent amount of bipartisan support, but it's been slow to adopt and make its way through the federal government. And as I mentioned, a lot of the times when change and reforms are enacted in the military services, the Coast Guard is basically excluded because they have a different jurisdiction within the federal government. So I think that's largely where the problem stems from.
That's what I want to kind of zoom into there. I think it's kind of fair to get into that jurisdiction discussion, and then a little bit more about why sexual harassment and assault continue to plague the U.S. Armed Services. Can you help me understand that jurisdiction issue you mentioned?
Yeah, so the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, they oversee the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard Academy. It's a different body that's regulating it and overseeing it, and that comes from the Department of Homeland Security. So a lot of the times when Congress has done anything in this space with sexual assault in the military, it is only applied to the three branches that I spoke of earlier that are under the purview of the Department of Defense. So a lot of the times when Congress has done something, it has come from this annual defense policy bill that must be passed, and there's been several different measures to go through it and pass through Congress. And again, it's just excluded the Coast Guard. And so it needs to go through either different pieces of legislation, different committees need to deal with it. Representative Joe Courtney from Connecticut was speaking to Andrew Brown of Connecticut Mirror and I about how they have tried to get congressional committees that have jurisdiction over the Coast Guard to basically waive their right and give other committees that deal with the military and these other branches the right to be able to apply these rules and these standards across the board. And so sometimes that's gone to with little avail, that has not worked out, or as we're seeing now, the Coast Guard has done some of this voluntarily. And I'm referring to Commandant Fagan basically said that they created a special prosecuting office over the summer, which is something that the military branches have had for quite some time. So we're starting to see an alignment, but this is kind of why it is harder to get things done in Congress when it comes to the Coast Guard.
Yeah, so you're kind of giving us an example of how the Coast Guard is able to not necessarily evade responsibility. One can say that, but they might be able to say avoid getting the attention of the Department of Homeland Security. What about the rest of the U.S. Armed Services? How come cases continue to proliferate there as well of sexual harassment and assault?
Again, I think it's a persistent problem through all of these branches, and they have certain practices in place. And so one of them is basically the safe to report provision, which again is kind of happened through this congressional bill that I'm referring to, but didn't happen at the Coast Guard, again, because it was through the purview of a defense bill in the Pentagon. And so basically what that allows is that if you're someone that has who wants to allege a sexual assault or sexual harassment or what have you, sometimes people are nervous to do it because the incidents might have involved alcohol and they're worried about getting in trouble for kind of unrelated things. And so a safe to report provision basically gives them the ability to not worry about getting in trouble for something unrelated to that, and to be able to safely report it and know that they're not going to face any other consequences, and that they can run this up the chain and try to get some relief from this. And so that is something that the three main ones have implemented, and I know it's something that especially Congressman Courtney would like to see implemented more broadly and for the Coast Guard.
something to watch, that safe to report provision. And something I just heard was you mentioning Representative Joe Courtney. What are federal lawmakers, including members of Connecticut's congressional delegation, saying about this?
Yeah, so I mean, again, Congressman Courtney has tried to have this apply to the Coast Guard. This was about 2 or so years ago, and they tried to. He was on a different committee that did not oversee the Coast Guard. They tried to waive that jurisdiction issue. That did not happen, and so I know, still wants to see safe to report be implemented at the Coast Guard. And something that Senator Chris Murphy is trying to do is he sits on an appropriation committee, and basically he is the one that's helping to write these budgets that fund all these different agencies for the federal government. It's the bill that basically prevents Congress and the federal government from having a shutdown. And so he sits on a Homeland Security committee that does write the budget for the Coast Guard. And so he doesn't have specific language yet, nothing that he could say really specifically, but he's trying to get language into that bill that would deal with some amount of accountability or transparency that would apply to the Coast Guard. So whether that be more swiftly and disclosing information to Congress, I mean, right, that's part of the issue of this whole kind of thing happening, is that the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard Academy didn't tell Congress about this. So I think that's what he's trying to tackle through this.
There's the transparency issue, but then there's the urgency issue too, which I think you're highlighting there as well. And Commandant Linda Fagan addressed members of Congress at a federal legislative committee hearing on July 13th. Let's play some tape for Lisa.
I again apologize to each victim, survivor, their loved ones. We failed to provide the safe environment that every member of the Coast Guard deserves. And I apologize to the committee for our failure to notify. Our service and our academy have made much progress, incredible amount of progress, yet work remains to be done.
Fagan's named Commandant in June of 2022. Lisa, what role, if any, does she play in all this? How much responsibility does she have here? Or was this largely hidden from her? What has she said?
It's hard to say. I mean, we're basically going off of what we know and what she has publicly said, including to when she was testifying in front of this committee. And so it is true, she did not become Commandant head of all of this until 2022. But notably, she has been part of the Coast Guard leadership for some time. And so she was vice commandant from 2021 and 2022. So she's been around for some time. She's been in leadership. And so she has largely seemed to take some sort of responsibility for all this. She is the head of the Coast Guard, and she did apologize for it. But it's still unclear what she did and didn't know, what was maybe hidden from her in leadership, and why that even happened. And so what she said at the committee basically was that she was broadly aware of fouled anchor, and she knew of one instance from it because in the position she held at the time, she had to relieve a commanding officer. And so she said, in her words, she used totality. She did not know the totality of the operation, the investigation, until CNN started poking around and asking questions. And so that is what she said. That is her testimony. She has made it clear that she is largely was absolved from this, or not absolved from this, but just wasn't made aware of it, that it was hidden from her. And so I think as, Congress pursues outside investigations, and this is, there's just more time, I think we'll try to get a better understanding of what she did or didn't know. And so that's kind of where it's at right now.
Okay, so she says that it's hard to know the totality of this whole thing, and maybe there was a little bit of an awareness of Operation Fouled Anchor. So what is she doing about it? What's the Coast Guard doing about it? What kind of steps are they taking to address this?
Right. She announced some things during the committee. She said that her team was going to conduct a 90-day review looking into transparency and accountability to get a better understanding of the culture. I think that was described pretty broadly. And so I'm curious to see exactly what that looks like, or exactly what it's revealing, or if they plan, based on what they learned from that review, if they'll implement anything going from there. Maybe one of those things is a safe to report policy, will yet to be seen. She also mentioned that they've provided behavioral health services to those that have come forward, and tried to make it clear that she would do so for any other people that decided to come forward in the future. And so that's kind of and then also she said that during the summer, so it's unclear if this was happening in tandem with CNN reporting this, or this was already something that the Coast Guard was implementing, but that they would create a special prosecutor's office. And I think I mentioned earlier that this is basically aligning with what the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force already does. And so having independent people be able to prosecute any of these alleged crimes. And so that's what the steps that they've taken. Congress wants to do their own thing. They want to do their own investigations. They made it clear they don't trust the Coast Guard doing this on their own. And so the Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington State, she was the one that was running that, or runs that committee that held that hearing. And she wants to basically, she's called for an inspector general investigation. She wants a third party looking into this. So this is kind of what's happening along with the steps that the Coast Guard Academy and the Coast Guard is taking.
Yeah, this is something that we've been reporting on both of our stations here, Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public, for the last 5 years. Coast Guard has at least known about this since 2014. Something we continue to talk about, and that's kind of like the alarming thing here, is that you're talking now maybe about the U.S. Coast Guard coming in line with some of the other branches. So is this more of an accountability problem, or is there still this culture of assault? What do you think? Is it solely the transparency, or is there any word on whether or not the assaults are still happening?
I think it's a combination of both, right? Because the scandal that has engulfed the Coast Guard Academy and the Coast Guard, it's something that, again, it was the fact that these are allegations and there's like some cultural or pattern thing happening within the Coast Guard, on top of the fact that it was unreported and then they didn't disclose this report and this 6-year investigation they did to Congress. So it's a little bit of both. And so I think going forward, they're going to need to deal with whatever is happening within the academy and whatever is happening within the actual service, to make sure that, women largely, but anyone in the Coast Guard is protected. And on top of that, making sure there's a protocol for addressing that, and then also, again, disclosing it to the correct people.
And don't forget, too, members of Congress, including Joe Courtney, have also said they want to investigate racism within the Coast Guard, too. So that's something to watch in the future. Back to sexual assault allegations. What do we know about the Coast Guard's current process of investigating sexual assault allegations? I know you said that there's talk of what they might do. What have they done, I guess, over the last couple of years?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it's, done internally, right? It's leaders within the service kind of dealing with this or prosecuting it. And so I think that's the big change that, again, I mentioned a lot of things that Congress is trying to do, but I think something that we will see that will actually change is the fact that the Coast Guard this summer has now implemented a special prosecuting office. So it is not maybe people that are within the ranks or within, again, not people internally. It's going to be independent military lawyers in the future who are going to be handling these types of allegations and prosecuting them and charging and what have you. So that is going to be a shift that we should see going forward. And so it's, again, not held and dealt internally.
And what have they been doing since 2020 too? Just to kind of button that up. In the last 3 or 4 years since they said that they've been taking action, what have they been doing? What was Commandant Fagan kind of leaning on as how they've addressed this? Anything there?
Yeah, I think it's all things. I think anything that she was bringing up was things that they were going to be implementing now, or things that they have implemented within the last year. And so I think, again, it's kind of taking things from internally and making sure that there is an independent arbiter basically dealing with these types of allegations. So
any word on the impact now for Coasties on whether or not people are going to want to serve in that branch? Any word on recruiting and retention?
Yeah, I think that was a really large and real fear that was coming out of Congress when they were talking with the commandant, and things that I heard from both Congressman Courtney and from Senator Murphy is that there's a fear that, it'll be tough to recruit, it'll be tough to retain talent and people within the service. It's Senator Dan Sullivan, who's a Republican from Alaska, brought this up at the committee where Commandant Fagan was testifying, and he's saying that basically equating to the worker shortage that's happening across the country in all different industries and all different sectors is happening within the Coast Guard and other military branches. And so there seems to be, limits to people joining, and there's definitely, again, a very real fear that this could have a ripple effect and worsen any recruitment or retention within the Coast Guard.
Devastating thing happening within the Coast Guard. I'm always, though, happy to talk to Lisa Hagan. Thank you so much for coming on the program. It's very hard to hide how I feel for Lisa as a friend, so I'm going to try not to be too happy to talk to you today. But thank you so much for coming on.
Awesome. Thanks, Frankie. Good to talk to you.
Take care, Lisa. Next, we'll look at the possible Metro North strike. You got any questions about that? Call us up, 888-720-9677. Barbenheimer. I got that out. All eyes have been on Hollywood lately. And over there, you got writers and actors on strike. But there's another potential strike that could impact Connecticut residents. The Transportation Workers Union, which represents several hundred train inspectors, is preparing for a strike that could shut down the Metro North Railroad this fall. For more on this, we're joined by a great friend. You're going to hear from him in a future program that we have on Connecticut Public's The Wheelhouse, too, as well. John Moritz, state reporter, CT Insider. Thank you so much for coming on this morning, John.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. If anybody wants to talk to me and John, you can give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. I got a big question for you to start. Why might members of the Transportation Workers Union strike this fall?
So what these workers are upset about is they basically are the people who go out every morning and inspect the trains, make sure that they're safe and up to standards, so that there's no issues along the lines. And they're one of several groups of employees for Metro North who are have been negotiating contracts dating back to 2019, which is when Metro North reached their new contract agreement with the city bus and subway drivers out in New York. And basically what these inspectors are telling me is that the MTA is not offering the same level of wage increases and benefits that they have offered to other groups of employees, which is part of the reason that they're threatening the strike.
Anything other to it? Anything else to it other than wages? John, you hear me?
Wages are
there you go.
Yeah, wages are the main issue
gotcha.
That they've represented to me, and the fact that they feel like they are being treated less well off than the other employees on the railroad and Metro North.
Why have they operated without this contract since August 2019? What's the holdup here?
So as I mentioned, the MTA reached their contract agreement with the city bus and subway workers back in 2019. And my understanding is that basically because that's the largest pool of workers for the MTA, that's kicked off a whole round of negotiations with all their other workers, people like train conductors, these train inspectors, and each one of those contracts has to be negotiated separately, which I understand is part of the delay.
For those that don't know, what do train inspectors do? How important are they to the functioning of our trains?
So when you talk to them, their argument is that they are vital to this railroad running. As I mentioned, they're responsible for making sure that the trains are up to standards and can run safely. And their position is if they don't come to work, the railroad won't be able to run and won't be able to take the tens of thousands of commuters that it takes every day between Connecticut and Grand Central Station.
Can you say that in the back? Say that so that the people in the back can hear? I think that's kind of the big issue here. And obviously, I don't want to overstate this because there's no word yet on whether or not this is imminent. But trains can't go if you don't got train inspectors, right?
That's correct, and that's their argument. And you bring up a good point that this is not people shouldn't be worried that this is a strike that is imminent. From what I'm hearing, the earliest that this could potentially happen is sometime this fall. They are still in the negotiating process, both with the MTA and with federal arbiters. So this is something that's still potentially months away. But the union has voted to authorize a strike should the current round of negotiations fall through.
Current round of negotiations, I understand the next session is August 1st. If the union does strike, what would be the immediate impact? We just talked about the fact that the trains could stop running. How does this impact service on Metro North?
So the union president, John Samuelson, he told me that he's received commitments from another union, that representing the train conductors, that they will not cross the picket line should the train inspectors union, the transit workers union, go on strike, which he assures me would essentially, as you mentioned, shut down the railroad. That would stop trains from running unless they could somehow find other workers to operate them. I had a colleague speak to Governor Ned Lamont yesterday, asked if he's been briefed on this issue. He said not yet, which I think lends itself to the idea that this isn't something that's imminent, but the union workers and the union officials are saying that this is something that they're prepared to do should it come to that.
They might be waiting for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority to say something. What is MTA saying? They operate Metro North. What are they saying about the potential strike?
Yeah, they did not respond to my request for comment when I first reported on this issue, so they haven't weighed in yet. We'll say the federal regulators did get back to me. They declined to comment. They were the ones overseeing the current round of mediation in Washington, D.C.
MTA, at last I had heard, had said that there's no imminent risk of a strike, and to suggest otherwise would be extremely misleading. I think they were kind of responding to that transportation workers union release that had gone out that said that they were prepared to strike. We also know that some of those workers had actually gone to New Haven and then another city. I think they went to Grand Central to hand out some material to let people know that there could potentially be a strike. Other transit workers for the MTA, including those who run the New York City subways and buses, are prohibited from striking under New York State's Taylor law, right? Where does this leave them?
So as I mentioned, the subway and bus workers, they reached their contract with the MTA back in 2019. But you're correct. There is a law in New York State called the Taylor law that prohibits certain vital public employees from going on strike. However, that actually hasn't stopped strikes on the MTA before. Back in, I believe it was the mid 1990s, there was actually a strike involving the same union, the Transportation Workers Union, in which city bus and subway workers walked off the job, and the union president actually ended up being jailed over it for violations of the Taylor law. Now, that wouldn't come into effect here with the threatened MTA or threatened Metro North strike, because the railroad that runs between New York and Connecticut is governed by federal law. It's not subject to the same Taylor law restrictions that certain New York State workers are prohibited from striking over.
You heard us talk about Barbenheimer at the top. You know, some people walked away from premieres and things like that because of the strikes that are happening in Hollywood. Just last question here, John. Do you see this enhanced, awareness around workers and rights? Do you think that has any impact on what can happen here in Connecticut and New York with Metro North?
I'm not sure whether the strikes that are going on elsewhere will end up factoring into the negotiations, which, as I mentioned, are ongoing in Washington, D.C. But it is an interesting point you bring up. When we asked Governor Lamont about it yesterday, one of the things he did mention was that there seems to be an awful lot of strikes lately. And it's something that these state governments, both in Connecticut and New York, they seem to be kind of going through these endless process of one important, vital public sector union after another is popping up demanding more, either wages or more benefits, more rights for their workers. And so this is something that public officials, I think, are really starting to have to pay attention to as these labor strikes gain national prominence.
And John, by mentioning that Governor Ned Lamont comment, you've now validated my ability to sneak in Barbenheimer into this show. So now I'm going to have a good rest of the day no matter what. And I appreciate you more than anything on this planet. Thank you, John.
Happy to help. Thanks for having me.
Take care, John. I appreciate you coming on the Wheelhouse. Coming up, the new kindergarten age cutoff in Connecticut. You want to talk about that? Give us a call, 888-720-9677. You're listening to The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're closing out today's show with a story causing a big stir across Connecticut, the new kindergarten age cutoff. Starting in 2024, students must be 5 years old by September 1st to enter kindergarten. Before this change, Connecticut had among the youngest school entry ages in the country. So what does this mean for children and their parents? For that and more, joined by two great guests, including one to my left. He's back on the Wheelhouse, Alex Putterman, reporter for CT Insider. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Frankie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Lisa Fiore, the professor and chair of the Education Department at Lesley University. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
And it's very important that you're coming on because it's a big conversation in Connecticut. It means a lot for development, so I appreciate having you on today, Lisa. And anybody that wants to join us in this conversation, we are taking your calls this hour, 888-720-9677. You don't even have to ask us a question. Just give us your reaction. I know there's a lot of folks that are thinking about this right now. A lot of it is because of Alex Putterman's reporting. So why is this change being implemented and what was driving it?
Yeah, so a bill was passed through the legislature during this recent session, and I think there were several reasons that lawmakers and proponents gave for it. Number one, this has been something that teachers and teachers' unions have pushed for a little while. They want older, more mature kids in kindergarten. They say that makes it easier to manage the classroom. They say that is better for the kids. It's better for the teachers. And then I think the other argument that was persuasive to a lot of people is, as you alluded to, Connecticut was sort of an outlier in having what had been a January 1st cutoff, which meant that kids could go to kindergarten at as young as 4 years and 9 months. Almost every other state has a much earlier cutoff than that. So I think lawmakers saw this as a way to sort of move Connecticut more in line with other states, for better or for worse.
Not a lot of talk about this during the legislative session, Alex. I didn't see necessarily anybody really report on it. It's not something that we saw. We try to say that we're on top of things here on the Wheelhouse. I guess we missed it, and I guess from talking to some folks, maybe it was something that popped into a bill. How did this come about?
Yeah, it ultimately passed as part of a big omnibus bill that did a whole lot of different things across the education system. I mean, there was a public hearing. You know, I knew it was at least in conversation. I believe in either February or March there was a public hearing. Some lawmakers testified, and Beth Bai, the Commissioner of Early Childhood Education. So it wasn't totally out of the blue, but I do think that for the amount of attention it's generated since it passed, it is maybe surprising that more people didn't catch on while it was happening.
And so take us through the new provision here, and I guess if there's any room for some kind of exemption or waiver.
Yeah, so for the most part, your kid has to be 5 entering kindergarten, 5 by September 1st of the school year. The exception is if you get a waiver, essentially, from your local principal. So that was another thing that they changed. Instead of having to go to the Board of Ed level, as you previously would have, you can now speak directly with the principal at the elementary school who can basically assess the kid and say, this kid is mature enough or developed enough or smart enough, or however they want to decide. There's a lot of leeway to enter kindergarten a little bit early.
So what are people saying in Connecticut about it? Are you talking to residents, or are you hearing some general reaction? What's the big thought about this?
Well, I'm talking to my wife, who was a December birthday and now feels personally affronted.
Yes, my son's got a January birthday. I know exactly how it is. Yeah.
But no, I think for a lot of parents, this is a big change. We haven't sort of touched on the other side of the argument, which is that for a lot of families whose kids were born in the burrs, as they say, September, October, November, December, that will mean likely an extra year of preschool or daycare or whatever it may be, which, as people know, is not generally cheap. We do not have any sort of universal public preschool in this state. And so for a lot of families, this means, a little bit extra cash. So I think the trivia of it is interesting to people. I hear a lot of people, my peers, who are just kind of amused by it because it was sort of so ingrained in when we were in school here in Connecticut. But then also on a very practical level for families whose kids are in this position, it could potentially make a big difference.
And it also highlights an issue that I've talked to child care folks about, that it's really hard to find daycares that provide second shift coverage, and now you're potentially putting people through another year of that. Lisa, we asked the Connecticut State Department of Education for comment on the update to the kindergarten eligibility. And before I get your reaction, I just want to play a clip for you. It comes from Ajit Gopalakrishnan, who is the department's chief performance officer.
Currently, with the January 1 cutoff date, Connecticut has some of the youngest entry ages for kindergarten. So this change does bring Connecticut more in line with where other states are. Kids come to us predominantly when they are eligible from an age perspective. They come when they're pretty much automatically eligible, and they are at varying different levels of readiness.
Lisa, can you react to what Gopalakrishnan is saying there about eligibility and readiness in Connecticut?
Sure. I personally and professionally think that readiness as a term is fairly arbitrary. So if you're looking at what readiness means and what children are going to be asked to demonstrate that they know and can do, again, that's arbitrary. So if we're wondering if a child can write or type, that's a skill that's typically not expected of a 5-year-old. If some do, that's great. If someone can write a couple of letters, they're writing. If someone can write an essay, they're also writing. If someone can walk, if someone can run, these are all developmental abilities that appear at different stages during a human being's development. So this term readiness, I think, needs to be looked at carefully, and people need to understand how we're defining it and what the implications are, because of course, once you start adjusting the entry date to kindergarten, that means that the ripple or trickle down effect will be that preschool programs and childcare programs with infants and toddlers are now going to have extra expectations to get children ready for kindergarten. So it's a serious topic that should be considered very, very well among all voting constituents.
And is it like this in other states, Lisa, where it's totally age-based like this?
It's like this in different states, and it's like this in different countries, and it reflects the values and priorities of a population. So in different countries around the world, children aren't expected to read until age 7, and there's no pressure for children to be able to demonstrate in an assessment, a standardized assessment. Our country is really hyper-focused on outcomes and assessments. And so we find ourselves, again, we're in this perennial race to somewhere. And children, unfortunately, I think, are paying the price, and families as well, when it comes to the burden, that the fiscal burden and also social and emotional burden for families to bear.
All right. So then you're really focused on this point about getting kids to read by a certain age. You're focused on their on them being age eligible for kindergarten. So naturally, you got to be doing a good job educating them before they turn 5, right, Lisa?
Right. So let's make sure every parent is now teaching their children basic math and reading skills at home.
You're saying it falls on the parents?
It falls on society, really. I think families are now going to feel the extra layer of stress, the extra layer of judgment, because of course, this is a competition. We live in a competitive landscape in our country. So I do think people are going to start worrying more about it. And my wish would be that everyone could take a deep breath and recognize that we'll all be okay and that this decision is a new decision. It's going to affect change. And I really hope that funding now is produced to help support high quality early childhood programs for families.
It's interesting that you played that clip, Frankie, from the Department of Education, because their stated position back before this passed, and I understand, how this works, but their position was, we will support this when there is universal pre-K in Connecticut, and that sort of takes care of theoretically some of the developmental questions and then also the financial ones, because people wouldn't have to be paying to put their kids into pre-K. In this case, they did not get their way, and now I guess they're kind of living with the results, but yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, you have Beth Bye, who you said testified there in February or March. I spoke to her the other day, and we're about to play a clip from her shortly. But before we do that, I just want to say I spoke to her the other day, and she said the same thing. Like, the line has been that we need universal pre-K. So I guess a little bit of a surprise here, but this one, as I mentioned, this clip comes from Beth Bye, and Alex, I'm going to play it for you. She's with the Office of Early Childhood, state agency that supports the development of children under 5. Beth Bye actually used to be a lawmaker, state representative, state senator as well. She opposed this kind of measure in the past, and she opposes it now.
Until we have universal preschool in Connecticut, when you change the kindergarten age, you make it so that there's a whole cohort of kids, a third of a cohort, that will have to wait a whole other year to have access to any educational setting if their parents don't have access to preschool.
So the cohorts here, she's talking about the cohorts of children in general that are in school, but now we're looking specifically on sort of impacted areas of children that are going to be really feeling this in their families. Who are they?
Yeah, I mean, as with everything in Connecticut, it seems there's kind of a haves and have-nots situation going on here. Oftentimes, the wealthier families will hold their kids back again and again, as much as they can get away with.
What's that called?
What is that called?
It's called redshirting.
Yes,
it's a sports
exactly.
term. Sorry.
Redshirting. Because then their kid can be the oldest and theoretically the smartest and the best at sports as compared to their younger peers. But when the lower income families often do not have that opportunity. In my conversations with Beth, she also made a excellent point about children with disabilities who need services, as much as anybody, and if their families can't afford it, are going to have a hard time getting those services until they turn 5. And we are talking about only a third of students, but that's a pretty sizable chunk. And for those students, and particularly those with high needs, they're going to have to wait a little bit longer to get services that they likely very much need.
Those children with disabilities many times have part-day, part-time programs, and the parents got to pick up the rest of the day if they aren't lucky enough to have some great insurance where they can get into a private program. That's something that Beth Bye highlighted when I spoke to her. And then there's the angle of low-income families. So can we talk about that? Lisa, jump in if you'd like to. What about the impact that it has on those families, traditionally, a lack of childcare?
Sure. I mean, again, going based on the assumptions and generalizations that we can make about a population based on their economic standing, it's assumed that families where financial resources are lower might struggle to find childcare, might struggle. I mean, if you're listing your list of priorities, rent, food, heat, those would take precedence over math tutoring and reading supports, one would imagine, maybe not. And maybe families have extra humans in the household who could help with childcare. Again, we don't know, but there are a lot of statistics and research that tells us that families where parents are working multiple jobs and struggling to make ends meet don't have the resources and time to focus on extracurricular supports for children that other families with more means can. So there is a very real concern that the achievement gap, as it's termed, or I think it's just a gap that persists, whether we want to title it achievement gap. It's a systemic gap that exists among populations within and across groups that's going to continue to exist and potentially widen when these types of measures occur without systemic supports for children and families.
And not to mention the rising cost of childcare. can cost as much of a mortgage for people. We talk about inflation and people not being able to afford a high percentage of their income in their mortgage. Think about adding childcare to that as well. So important, Lisa, that you brought up the fact that people got to pay for heat, other things. Wow, we're putting people through a lot nowadays. What about universal pre-K childcare? Is there a way to balance delaying kindergarten, Lisa, and addressing the needs of lower and middle income families?
I think it's our responsibility, again, as a society, as a democracy, to provide supports to our citizens. And so universal pre-K has been a topic of conversation for over a decade. It's been around for a long, long time. And, again, it comes down to dollars and resources. So I do think there is a will, but then there's often the tug at the other end of the rope. What takes greater precedence over things? So I do think it's going to take a coordinated effort by citizens to show their discontent and push for these priorities. And I was looking up some voter turnout percentiles to see, rates of civic engagement. And, our society's voter turnout is always sort of low. And, maybe this is something that'll spark some energy as we head into an election year.
Last sort of questions here for you guys here as we finish up. Alex, give me some way forward here. What are people in Connecticut saying about the future? Do you think a lot of people are going to be either applying for these waivers, or is there some kind of thought to laws next year? What's the session going to look like next year regarding this?
It's hard to say. I could definitely imagine this coming up given the sort of response and in some cases backlash that there has been. I know, Beth talked about potentially they could have slowed down the process. I don't know if it's too late to do that, which would at least sort of ease the immediate term burden on preschools. At the end of the day, I think most states have made this move, and the effects, that Lisa is talking about are there, I'm sure, but the sky hasn't fallen and they've moved on and it's been what it's been. I don't know if this will be revisited. I think, it's possible if enough people are mad about it, it's possible. But I think probably the most likely outcome is come July 1st, 2024, we have a new kindergarten start date, and that's that.
And maybe before that, they'll try to institute universal pre-K. Who knows?
I wouldn't bet on that one, but crazier things have happened.
Lisa, got about a minute left here. What advice do you have for parents who are figuring out if their child's ready for kindergarten?
Well, I just wanted to know the sky might not have fallen, but systemic inequities continue to exist. So I think that's really important for us. I think parents who are wondering about their children's readiness, I do think it's great to talk to other parents and to, again, breathe, realize that, childhood is meant to be a time of joy and play. Play is woven a lot into this bill. So I was pleased to see a lot of attention given to play-based learning and talking about play. So that's good. So I would encourage parents to read with their children when they can in the supermarket, in the library, and get outside and play.
Big thanks to Alex and Lisa for joining us. We appreciate your support today on The Wheelhouse. Before we go, a development in Connecticut politics. Arunan Arulampalam has been endorsed by Democrats in Hartford's mayoral race in an upcoming show. A little foreshadowing here on August 9th. We're going to go big on some of the mayoral elections taking place this fall. You got questions about races in Hartford, like where Arulampalam is, Bridgeport, New Haven, beyond? Send them our way. Email wheelhouse@ctpublic.org. Today's show produced by Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Thanks to Tess Harrible for helping us out in studio as well. Special thanks to our interns, Stacey Addo and Carol Chen. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thanks for listening.